Okay, I want to just take a little side detour here and take a look at inflation rates, how we would come up with those numbers, where we could find those numbers, and maybe look at an alternative scheme here to figure out how inflation protected securities would change over time. So what I want to do first is take a look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, some of the information that you receive from those folks every month whenever inflation is measured by the Fed. So we could just go to the internet here, and if we type in bls.gov, that's the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and one of the key statistics that they report on, they keep track of, is the CPI. So this happens to be a very recent story about what CPI was for the month of August. So if I click on that little story here, I can see that the headline number, the CPI, was 0.2%, or it increased by 0.2% for the month of August. And if I march down here a little further, I can see that the CPI for all items over the past 12 months was 2.7%. So those are kind of the key numbers that frequently get reported in news stories and business news stories. We'll see what the CPI increase was for the previous month and then for the previous 12 months. Let's go look at another source of inflation data. And if you ever are looking for statistics on different economic indicators in different variables, we can go to the St. Louis Federal Reserve. They have the FRED database. I think it's Federal Reserve Economic Data. So this is a very handy website. And again, I'm in this particular case looking at or concerned with CPI. If I look down here near the middle of the page, I see this CPI for all urban areas. Oh, and by the way, that has that headline number of 2.7% change from the previous year. So the nice thing about this is it tracks this data, shows this data, and we have it all the way back on a monthly basis, going back almost a little over 70 years, back to 1947. So I want to look at the previous 10 years. Goodness. So I'm going to go to 2008. And we'll just go to August of 2008, August 1st, 2008. This is what the CPI index looks like over that time frame. I can download that data, so let me go ahead and do that, and we're going to play around with some of these numbers briefly. So I'll put that into an Excel spreadsheet, and we'll talk about what some of this stuff means and how we can use it. So this is what the data look like. We've got an inflation index for a month, and it's the measurement for each of those months over time. If I were to look at the month over month inflation, I could just take the month that we're concerned about, divide it by the previous month, subtract out 1, and then format that with 1 decimal place for the percentage change. And if I copy that all the way down, I want to look at this most recent month that we just saw in that BLS story, and it is in fact 0.2%. Now that's not terribly precise because there's a little bit more information there. That's why it's nice to use the CPI number, the inflation index number, we can get a more exact change in things. But let's just stick with the 1 decimal place for now. This is what was reported. Next, I want to do a little calculation here for year over year. And so to do that, I'm going to go out to August of 2009. I'm going to take the August 2009 index number, divide that by the August 2008. Again, take away 1, and this will give me a percentage change. And in this case, the CPI was 1.5% lower than it was the previous year. This is a case of deflation. I can copy that formula down to August of 2010. And so now I see the inflation over those previous 12 months of 1.2%. If I continue to copy these down, I can see some annual rates. So in August 2011, we had an annual inflation rate of 3.8%. August 2012, 1.7%. August 2013 of 1.5%. And again, you can see the calculation here. I'm just taking the month that I'm concerned with, dividing it by 12 months prior, then take away 1, format that as a percentage, and I get the percentage change. Let's just keep marching up here to the most recent month, and we'll talk about how we might use that when we're using or calculating inflation protected securities. So these are all of the year-over-year changes for the past 10 years. And for an inflation protected security, I would be using the CPI numbers to adjust my principal balance. Now in this case, in the case of a TIP security, we're not really concerned with year over year. That's what's typically reported. We would actually be using every 6 months, so semi-annual rates of inflation. And here we would look at we would look at 6-month periods and the change in the index over that period of time, and then adjust that for or get 1 decimal place there. So this is the 6 months from August 2008 to February 2009. The next 6 months period is now increasing at a 1.3% rate, and we could again march forward every 6 months and figure out what the 6-month or the semi-annual inflation rate is. And that's what we were using in calculations, at least here. I reported the annual. We're adjusting that to be a semi-annual basis. Now, in reality, what we would want to be doing here is not calculating a semi-annual rate, rounding it to 1 decimal place, and then using this in our calculations. In reality, we're going to be using these index numbers and adjusting for inflation using those. So let's just see what that might look like if we did this for real over a particular 4-year period. I'm going to just tweak this spreadsheet, this example here, with a new set of numbers. So down here at the bottom of the spreadsheet, bottom of this page, I've put in some kind of a new way of looking at inflation using the CPI index, the CPI numbers from the Fed. So here we've got the inflation index that's tied to a particular period, particular month. And so when this bond is issued, we're assuming that it was starting in February of 2009, when the inflation index was at 212.71. Our principal was $100,000, and we're going to adjust from there. So in August 2009, the inflation index was 215.45, and if I go over here to the inflation data and just double check that, August 2009, my inflation data was 215.445. If I go out, yeah, I can see that is indeed the case. So this is keeping all that information, and we're doing the calculations based on a much more precise basis. So to figure out what my adjusted principal is going to be, I'm just going to basically grow the 100,000 by the difference between these two things. So if you take a look at my formula here, I'm going to multiply 100,000 times the current CPI, the current inflation index number, and divide it by the previous period's inflation index, so the 6-month prior inflation index number. So that tells me the change over the previous 6 months in inflation, and therefore in the adjusted principal. And then I'm going to just keep marching that formula forward, looking at, again, every period's change in the inflation index. So if I use this formula, it's marching it forward based on a 6-month change in the inflation index. So I get all the way down here to the bottom, and I've got a growth all the way out to 109,511, and that takes into account the inflation that has happened over this period of time. By the way, let's just take a quick look at that. If I divide the last number by the first number, take away 1, I'm going to get 9.511. You can see here that it matches exactly with the change in the principal that we've had from 100,000. Now we're 9.51177% bigger than we started with. So the ending principal amount is going to be the 109,000. Our coupon payments are as we talked about before, where we take the coupon rate of 1.25%, multiply it times the adjusted principal. Here is my net cash flows. In this case, the nominal payments would give me an IRR, or a yield, of 3.55%. If I adjust it for inflation, I'm still going to have that 1.25% real rate of return. And now the inflation factors might be a little bit more easy to see where they're coming from, or where the calculation is happening. it's just going to be the difference between the very first inflation index number and the one that we're concerned with. And again, I'm taking the quotient of those, subtracting out 1 to get the percentage change. So over the first 6 months period, it's gone up by 1 point, a little bit under 1.3%. If I go all the way out here to the end and look at the difference between the last one and the first one on a percentage basis, the inflation factor is a cumulative of 9.51177%. So this is getting us to the same kind of place. It's still using inflation to adjust our principal and figure out the real cash flows. This might be a little bit more precise and a little bit more handy using an inflation index number. It's more exact, certainly. And if you can do these calculations, understand these calculations, this would be more useful in kind of a real world setting. So this is an aside, and we'll pick up in the next video looking at the next part in the PowerPoint presentation where we examine in some detail the Treasury auction process. So I'll see you then.